So Andy, you're the person responsible for producing this lovely fort. Would you like to tell us something about how you made it?
Yes. As I said, it started off from actually viewing it for real. Had a walk around it. It's beautifully preserved. Apparently it's one of the least fettered and messed about with earthworks in the country. It is quite large and had a real issue obviously with any war game with ground scale. If I actually built it to scale, I think it's round about 4.5 feet wide, which obviously wouldn't suit the game. So I've had to adjust it a little bit in terms of size. The actual construction was made out of, cunningly placed prop here, some of this XPS foam. It's a hard foam which we use really commonly in the club, and I've used many times before, particularly because it's very easy to work. In terms of what it is, it's usually about 50mm deep, and we can buy it in large sheets. This was actually a series of offcuts and bits and pieces from some of the larger ones larger boards and bits and pieces we'd done, and basically copied the shape of the gun platforms. They're all stuck onto a fibreboard base to give them some rigidity, and then after that, once cut the shape, got a router, so routed the shape of the gun platform in the top, and then marked out the slope I wanted, which is about 45 degrees, and then cut it with what's called a Japanese saw. It's got no spine on it, so I'll just go through and created all the shapes. Took a little while, but 4 identical gun platforms, and then the just standard sides were done much simpler, and then had a lot of fun with the little outcrop and the bit there with much more routing and a bit fiddlier. But it's actually not as difficult as it looks.
Okay, thank you, Andy. The river's made from, it's a scratch built from blue vinyl. The banks are made from balsa wood strips, and the vegetation is a green doormat stuck along the edge.
Classic wargaming make, do and mend.
Yeah.
And sorry, I have to have a little bit of a thank you to Renedra for the little gabions that are in there. And again, the router just happened to be exactly the right size, so they're actually literally wedged in. A little bit of dry brushing on that, and good old faithful with some coffee stirrers and a bit of minimal carpentry on the gate. But apart from that, not a particularly difficult build, but we've tried to represent the shape and the idea of the fort rather than the true dimension of it.
The fort at Earith is a classic example of a star fort, which is what they were called in the Civil War. Originally, they arose in Holland during the war with the Spanish, the War of Liberation, the 80 Years' War, and they became a kind of standard European fortification. They allow for crossfire and they allow for defence in depth, really, but they were easy to throw up. It took a fair few man-hours, but they weren't. If you had an engineering charge who could lay it out properly, it wasn't a difficult thing to create, and you could make them quite rapidly. And in fact, there were dozens of them at the sieges throughout the Civil War, either defending or for the attacking forces. The best example is at Newark, the Queen's Sconce, which is still in existence. I can heartily recommend a visit to that, and that is massive. It's about 3 times taller than the one at Earith, because that was low down but down by the river valley. But the one at Newark is huge.
And the style of this kind of thing has led on to many things after that, up to Napoleonic times.
Yeah, it was still in use. This design was still in use right through the 18th century, Marlborough's wars. Vauban was a very famous engineer who became the epitome of this style of fortification. And there are still some brick and stone versions in this country.
Fort George in Scotland.
Exactly. So it was, and right up until the American Civil War and even World War One, this style of fortification was still being used.
So, in terms of the actual style, we even picked up during the game that there was some beautiful, with the cannons turned, there were some beautiful raking shots down the front of the banks, and also they covered each other's particular gun platforms, which proved quite exciting for one of the cavalry units during the game. Just talking about the game, and this is kind of a dual one here, we had to make some modifications. As beautiful and elegant as Pikeman's Lament is, it doesn't cover a variety of things that we wanted to include. But it's very easy to put modifications in within the turn structure. So do you want to talk about some of the ones that you were involved with?
The first point to make really is that Pikeman's Lament is a campaign system as well as a set of games rules. And so tracking the honour of your officers is an important part of it if it's used in an ongoing campaign. As we have done at the club, we've run a couple of English Civil War campaigns using Pikeman's Lament, and it's been important to track what happened to the officers. Because this was a one-off, we stripped out all that kind of stuff from the game rules, including setting aside the officer traits that you would dice for, simply because we didn't feel it was relevant to this kind of game.
So that's how we simplified it, and in other ways we made it more complex. And one of my personal ones was that in the fens, when it's quite quiet and down by the water, you get some absolutely shocking fogs. And as you can see in the game, we started with the fog within a foot of the fort to represent the maximum view that they had. And a very simple dynamic, in fact, a very simple piece of fog. We had a series of fog banks which were just literally paid out along the edge and moved as we needed them. But they moved d6 on the first move, 2d6 on the second and 3d6 on the third, just to represent the fog burning away as the sun came out. What were your particular interests?
Well, we had to invent some rules as well, or produce amendments. So, for instance, the cart full of gunpowder over there, heading for the other bridge, we decided that you would have a guard of a few figures. So effectively it was a kind of very slowly moving commanded shot unit that would always stay with the wagon, defend it if it was attacked, but would not carry out any offensive manoeuvres. Its job was to get that wagon to that bridge over there to blow it up, basically.
So that was moving automatically if the officer wanted to, so no rolling for that. And you also had some automatically moving boats coming along the river. We
decided that the boats were trying to be stealthy, so they wouldn't. This was no Oxford and Cambridge boat race going on here. So they would be silently rowing as quietly as they could up the river, again carrying gunpowder to blow the bridges. So they again moved at walking speed. They moved automatically. It's a bit hard to stop a rowboat because it will keep moving even when you stop rowing. So we decided we weren't going to dice for that. But once it got there, we had a set of rules to decide whether they had successfully attached the charges to the bridge. So we used that as a move activation, and then they had to dice to see if they could actually set the fuses. And then eventually, it didn't come to that, but there would have been another dice roll to see whether the fuses actually worked or not.
And just as a bonus to that and a little bit of history, the river is actually, or was at that time, tidal up to this point. So that obviously they could use the benefit of the tide bringing them in. One of the other things that was kind of relevant, because we had two commands of 24 points of royalists, one coming through Earith and one coming from the north, they could choose where they went. The other one, we needed to come up with some command rules for the fort, because you can probably make out it's bigger than a foot across, so that when we had a commander in there in charge of the garrison, we were happy to make the rule that anybody actually within the bounds of the fort had the bonus to their activations and their morale of the commander who was in the fort. It's assumed that there was some kind of command structure and they were aware of what's going on. Didn't count it for the little outpost, so they were rolling on their own, and any units scampering around outside didn't get that benefit either. And the other bonus we had was that there were two commands within the fort. We had a master of artillery who has, during the game, run off into the centre here, but as long as he was in the fort, he was able to add his bonus to any of the three guns that were placed around.
In terms of the guns, we changed the rules slightly. We decided to give them a longer range of 24 inches just because they're set up right in the fort, which would mean that they find it easier to get the range. They're also elevated as well. So we gave them all the range of a field gun as per the rules, which meant that they could cover the river and the bridge, and also just about reached the other bridge. But they didn't fire any better than a regimental gun.
And with my dicing, they didn't fire much at all during the middle of the game. And we also originally played the rated artillery piece, which really didn't suit. It was just too powerful, so we put them all as the same kind of small standard field gun. Anything else that we missed out? We had a little bit of fun with one or two bits and pieces and a few of the characters in there.
Well, in terms of moving around the fort, we assumed there were ways up onto the ramparts, and that you didn't have to have the whole unit on the rampart for the unit to fire. So that made it easier in that sense for the defenders. It doesn't look. It's not as good as it looks, this fort. It only gets you +1 on your stamina. So it wasn't actually too hard to shoot the defenders off the walls if the Royalists could manage to coordinate their fire and actually fire and throw the dice needed to actually fire, which they failed to.
And I think
quite a lot of times.
I think the main issue was that the water we assumed would make difficult going, and therefore it would take a turn to cross it on most units, and then a turn to go up the bank. So it was 2 turns exposed.
Well, we decided it had to be an attack activation to actually get onto the ramparts to fight the people behind.
Which in some of the trials proved doable, but it seemed that in the actual game they didn't really get as far as they'd have hoped.
No. But overall it was a close run game.
Yeah.
In the end, the Royalists quite clearly were able to sabotage this bridge because they held the other side of the bridge. The charges had been laid, the fuses had been set. They were starting to retreat over the bridge, and they would have blown that bridge. The other bridge had been seized by reinforcements sent from Cambridge, which had arrived just in the nick of time, and they didn't manage to seize the fort.
Yeah, amazing what a 6 followed by 6 can do, isn't it?
But the Royalists would have claimed a mighty victory, I feel. They would have gone back to HQ claiming that they blew up the bridge, they slaughtered many of the defenders on the walls, and gave the Eastern Association a big fright, basically.
Was very much touch and go, and I think the way, if I was going to attack, would be to sit and put a couple of units of shot just to pick away at some of the muskets on the fortification, because if that does, they start losing figures. Harder to hit, obviously, with the extra stamina, but once you start picking away and they start losing their morale, the morale rolls are difficult, and as we saw, 2 of my units were pushed back and basically evaporated and ran away in very quick succession right near the end of the game.
One of the features of Pikeman's Lament is that commander's shot can't be shot at from beyond 12 inches. But we decided that if you were defending an outwork and you got your head and musket popped up, you could be seen from over 12 inches away. So that did give a slight advantage to the musketeers on the Royalist side in that they could outrange the commander's shot.
And in many occasions this unit ran away just to avoid being shot at. But as I said, the main one was that I got 1 unit of your standard muskets left, so the shot were really, really vulnerable, and it wouldn't have taken much more to have convinced that unit to go as well. So it was really, really touch and go.
Yeah.
I think in the end it was down to morale and who stayed around longest.
Yes, the commander of the Royalists on that side was very unlucky. He ended up retreating a couple of times. Eventually he disappeared, and that meant that attack had stalled. And the appearance of the reinforcing cavalry just meant that they were not going to make any further progress.
Convinced him to leave.
Yeah.
And the only issue we had with this Royalist force is they were always at the mercy of the bridge, and if they were going to blow the bridge at some point, they would either have to take the fort or leave and blow it, and which I think was the better part of valour on Andrew's part. Apart from that, the game went smoothly, much as we expected or hoped.
Yeah.
And if you're a fan of Pikeman's Lament, hopefully you've enjoyed or maybe marvelled or cringed at the way we've stretched the rules a little bit or changed them slightly. Yeah. But that's kind of half the fun of the game and why we do it.
I mean, at the club we've used Pikeman's Lament to fight major battles, just with a few minor tweaks to make it suitable for that. It does work with a bit of thought to fight big battles with.
Yeah, and it seemed to work, and it was enjoyable for all three players, and it hinged literally on 2 or 3 rolls at a crucial point where morales were passed or failed. So I think we balanced it reasonably well, and if nothing else, it was a bit of fun.
Yeah.
We learnt a little bit about the fort.
But just as the scenario's historically plausible, the way the game turned out is very historically plausible. The Pikeman Lament's rules, although they are fairly abstract in some senses, they do tend to produce a result you can believe in terms of historical outcomes. And I think that happened this time. The thought of the Royalists actually taking the fort in the long run probably wasn't going to happen, but then being able to destroy a bridge or two, they certainly did, and they kind of got away with it, although with heavy casualties.
And without being too biased as 2 parliamentary players, it was the right result in the end.
I think so, yeah. I think the Royalists would claim a victory, the parliamentarians would claim a victory, so it was a kind of winning draw for the Royalists, I feel, having managed to secure and destroy the bridge, which would seriously disrupt communications with the Isle of Ely. They would have a lot of trouble replacing this bridge once it had blown, and it would be a severe fly in their ointment.
Yep. All in all, good fun, and
Yep.
I think we'll finish it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.